Hello everyone, my name is Cameron Joyce. I'm a staff solutions architect here at VMware, and today we're going to be going over a solution demo of VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. I'm going to walk you through kind of some of the basic architecture, and then we'll get into what it takes to actually set up your first site, get some data replicated, and do a test failover. We're not going to go through every piece of the solution. We're not going to look at things like setting up Direct Connect or site-to-site VPNs or HCX. There are enough other resources on how to do those things, and they don't differ for VCDR. So we're just going to kind of focus on the core services. So to get into this, let's take a look at the architecture of VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. So there's a few different things that we need set up to get VCDR working. In the case of this demo, as well as any proof of concept or live production deployment of VCDR, the first thing that we need is, of course, the VCDR environment. So in the center square there, you can see our scale-out cloud file system. You can see our SaaS orchestration. And these are things that are going to be deployed by VMware support prior to the setup of a POC or to a production deployment. These are not things that a user can set up on their own. This is something that support has to set up for them. And it will be set up into a tenant that is VMware owned but named for the customer. The second thing that will happen on the back end is we will create a org for the SDDC. So we will create a VMC org. If the customer already has an org, we can use an existing org, but we cannot use an existing SDDC. So a new SDDC will be created. And then, of course, we need to deploy the on-premise connector, and that's going to be part of the demonstration today. So where we are before we actually look at the interface is support has deployed our Cloud DVX and our control shift. So we have our replica site all set up. We've deployed a SDDC so that we don't have to wait the 90 minutes for that to be up and online. And we just need to connect our site, which is going to be called CTJ Home Lab or CTJ underscore HL. We need to get that connected. We need to get some VMs replicating, and then we need to actually get those failing over. So we'll go ahead and switch from here into the interface, and we'll get going. Okay, so next thing that we need to do is, of course, we need to log into our VMware Cloud DR interface called Control Shift. And we do that by logging into our VMware Cloud Services portal and selecting the tile from here. I've already got this open on this pane. And you'll notice that we have a welcome. We have some quick setup steps so that if you're new to VCDR, maybe you're setting up a new site, or maybe you're doing this without support or a customer success advocate, you can follow these steps yourself and you can get set up. Before we focus in on our sites, though, I just kind of want to take you through a brief tour of this front page here. So, of course, we have our system health, which is looking at the underlying system health, making sure everything's okay. We have our cloud backup targets. In this case, we only have a single target that we're backing up to. We're backing up 456.2 gigabytes. So again, when we meter for the consumption, 456.2 gigs is what we're metering. We have 4 sites that we're protecting. We have a single recovery SDDC. That SDDC has been running for a month. So this is important if you're not using reserved hosts, if you're using our on-demand, having that right up front, letting you know, hey, I've got hosts running, they've been running for this long. It lets me know that maybe if I didn't clean up a test, it's time to go do that so that I stop getting charged for these. My VMs in groups. This is letting me know of these sites that I'm protecting. I have 4% of my VMs as the total sum of these sites. I have 4% of the VMs being protected. This could let me know that maybe I'm not protecting everything I need to be protecting, and I need to go take a look at my protection groups and figure that out. It might let me know that I maybe have a ton of VMs that I don't need. Maybe I've got a site that has a ton of VMs sitting at it that it's time to purge and get rid of. So it's just a good indicator to let me know kind of where I am. And then, of course, number of DR plans. So letting me know how many plans I have and how many how many things I'm orchestrating. Off to the right-hand side, I have my running tasks, pretty self-explanatory. I have my recently finished tasks, so it lets me know tasks, whether they were successful or failed. If they've finished recently, they show up here, and then below that, I have my alarms. So I've got, again, just event, warning, and critical showing up here. So just a really good high-level way to interact with the interface. Next thing that I can do on initial setup is I can go ahead and I can configure some email alerts. So we would need to say, hey, if we want to configure some email alerts out, we can configure that here. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and we'll add my VMware email here. We'll call it Cameron-VCDR. I'll hit OK. And on the back end, I will, of course, need to validate that with AWS before I can use that email to send and receive. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Sites here, and we would need to create a new site. So we'll go ahead, we'll create our site here, give it a name, we'll select time zone. I'm in Central time zone, so I could click that and it will default. But we've already created my site here, so I'm going to go ahead and select it. First thing that I need to do is I need to download the collector appliance. So I need to download the OVA, and it gives me all the steps I need to do here. And then, of course, it also gives me the ports outbound, only outbound, not inbound, that I need open from this collector. It's going to give me the appliance URL to deploy. It's going to give me the default credentials for the client, the orchestrator FQDN. So that's going to be how we connect the on-prem connector into the cloud. And then, of course, it's going to give me the one-time use passcode to validate that this connector is, of course, allowed to talk to this instance of VCDR. So let's go ahead and let's get that going. So I'm going to copy the URL. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to come to my my home lab here. We're going to throw this in my backup folder. I want to tell it I want to deploy from an OVF from that URL. We're going to call this AS for Aperture Science, then DRC for DR Connect. This will be my first connector that I'm deploying. We are going to deploy it into my prod cluster, of which I only have one host. It's going to validate the OVF template, so it's going to take a little bit longer because it's got to do it from the cloud versus doing it locally. You, of course, can download the template and put it into your inventory locally if you'd like, but one of the upsides of pulling it directly from the cloud is that you're always going to get the latest version. So you don't need to worry about having a template that deploys itself and then immediately updates once it comes online. I'm going to say next. I'm going to select my DVX storage here. I want to thin provision that VM. I don't need to encrypt it. It's going to ask us to do the IP configuration as part of the VM setup, which is why the options are not here. I'll click Finish, and we're going to deploy. Okay, so we've deployed the DR Connect virtual appliance. And after you do the deployment and initial power on of the DR Connect virtual appliance, you do need to wait about 10 minutes for it to finish deploying its payloads and getting ready for actual utilization. You'll also notice that I switched over to the VMware Workstation client so that I could copy and paste directly into the VM rather than having to type things out. So when we get to the secret key and the connection string, those are going to be important. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to set the network. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up as static. I'm going to pick an IP address. Whoops. I'm going to pick an IP address that I know is open in my environment. And it's going to test my outbound connection just to make sure that all the ports are open, that is a valid IP address, gateway, DNS, etc. And once it's done testing the network, we can go ahead and move on. While it's testing the network, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pop over into the tab that contains the configuration settings for the VM, and I'm going to copy my orchestrator FQDN and my password. So orchestrator FQDN, we're going to go ahead and we're going to paste that in. Let's go to edit and paste. There's that. It was successful. Now I need to grab the password. Go ahead and grab the password. Paste that as well. We're going to enable a site to and if I had multiple, I could of course label that O1, O2, etc. There are certain cases where you'll want multiple connectors at a single site. One of them would be if you have maybe two HA clusters in your vCenter environment that have different storage attached to them. You can deploy one connector in each of those HA clusters so that the connector is able to directly attach to that storage and you're not having to pull over the network, being one good reason. Another good reason might be multi-threading connections into the cloud. So having multiple streams replicating to the cloud at the same time will of course help with replication time. Putting connectors in DMZs so that you don't have maybe some internal resources that can't talk to the edge. They can talk to the DMZ instead. A lot of different reasons why we might have multiples, but usually the storage that doesn't talk to each other or hosts that don't talk to multiple storage arrays is the most common. So we have added the connector to the on-premise site. It'll finish its configuration here. And while it does that, we're going to go ahead and swap back into the VCDR console. And we're going to take a look at protection groups and then, of course, recovery groups. Alrighty, so we've got our ASDRC01 connector created here. You can see that it's happy, it's healthy, it's communicating. One of the other things to know about this is when we connect this to VCDR, that default username and password gets changed. So we don't have this as a that easy password. We go ahead, we randomize the password, and then we update it every 5 minutes. And so if I come in here, I can actually grab the username and password for this connector if I needed to log into it locally, maybe for a support assist or something like that. So just be aware that even though we do have the default password, it does get changed and then it gets rotated, and that rotation is controlled by Control Shift. So nice and easy. Next thing we need to do, we need to register a vCenter. So we'll go ahead and do that. You do not need to use administrator. Oops. It helps if I can type and spell. But you don't need to use administrator at vSphere Local if you don't want to. However, with that being said, you do need to use an account that has the administrator role. So if you want to use your domain account or maybe a service account, that's totally fine. But it needs to have the administrator role within vCenter. And I'm going to go ahead and get my password in there. I'm not going to add that. And it'll take just a moment here. And you'll notice that, fantastic, we are all connected. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to create a protection group. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to call this CTJ Demo. And I've got a couple ways that I can add VMs. The first way is I can add the VM name. So in this case, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do ASPI star. And I'm going to go ahead and I could also exclude. So in this case, I want to back up my Pi-hole DNS server to the cloud so that when I fail over, I have my DNS in the cloud, my internal DNS that is. And maybe if I wanted to exclude some tags, I could do that. If I hit preview VMs here, it's going to go ahead and it's going to find that server. It's going to show me that everything's good. And then the next thing I could do is I could add another query. And so maybe I want to add a tag query. So if I'm using tags for either VROPS or Verni or NSX, or maybe I'm just using tags because it integrates with my backups, I can pull those here. In my case right now, I don't have tags in my on-premise vCenter, so it's telling me that I have no categories, but it is something that's available. And of course, the last thing I could do is also a VM folder. So if I'm maybe in an organization where we've had multiple naming conventions over the years, creating a naming convention would be kind of difficult. I can come in here and I can pull what I need. So if I needed to figure out what folder a VM is in, I can of course click the VMs button and it will query the vCenter and it will show me what VMs are in that folder. You'll notice that the folders are not recursive. So if I were to grab the apps folder here, which has no VMs in it, whoops, there you go. If the apps folder has no VMs in it, that folder selection will not include the VMs in backup and monitoring. I would need to specify the backup and monitoring VMs as well. Okay, so we have our name pattern selected. The last thing to note is that, of course, you can use tags and folders all together. So you can use a combination of all three, two of the three, however makes the most sense to you, to build out your protection group. Now we're going to hit our protection schedule. So we have a few different schedules that we can select from. Of course, we can do every 4, 6, 8, and 12 hours. Makes it pretty easy to make some selections there. I could do dailies, I could do weeklies, and I could do monthlies. Personally, I like to do 4-hour snaps. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to set a 4-hour snap. We're going to do that for 1 day. Then I'm going to roll those to a daily, and I'm going to keep those for 14 days. And then I'm going to roll those to weeklies, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep those for a month. So I have a connector created, I have a vCenter created, I have a protection group created, and the last thing that I need to do while I move on to the next pieces of everything is I need to actually get this synchronizing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create my first synchronization. Now, I could just wait for the schedule to kick in, but I don't have that time. I want to start this now, and I want to get my VM syncing. So I'm going to call this CTJ Demo dash initial. So of course, every time you take a manual snapshot, you can name it. So maybe if it's for a maintenance window or a patch or something like that. Oops. Okay, we're going to keep this for 6 months because I want this base to be around for a long time, so that if I run into any issues with synchronization in the future, I have a base data set that I can build off of. The other thing is, of course, we don't want you in the situation where your initial sync takes a long time and it basically lands and then immediately expires, and you're always running into this land and expire, land and expire, land and expire. So I'm going to tell it that I want the initial for 6 months. Tell it to take snapshot, and that's going to go ahead and it's going to kick off that task. And we can watch that in the running tasks while we work on our next pieces. Next thing that we need to do is we need to look at our SDDC configuration. As I mentioned at the beginning, the SDDC is pre-configured. So in this particular case, we have gone ahead and we have created an SDDC. And now I need to come in here and start looking at the options that we've used to configure. So for instance, in clusters, I have an initial cluster here of a single host. It's an i3 instance. And one thing to note is that this cluster, being a single host, is only valid as a test configuration. The single host cluster does need to be refreshed once a month. And so if you're testing, if you're doing your initial configuration, something like this, you don't want to burn all of your credits, that's fine. You can do a single host, but single host is not for full-time run. We can add a host to this cluster. You'll notice that I go from 1 to 3 hosts. Why doesn't it allow me to go from 1 to 2, then 2 to 3? Well, because with the configuration of vSAN on the back end, if you are going to create a 2-host cluster, it has to be the initial creation. So when you create a new cluster, it's either going to be a 1-host or a 2-host. And then you can scale from there. Of course, scaling this cluster up will incur additional charge, and I can click Add Hosts to scale to my 3-host. Once I've scaled to 3, I can add individual hosts after that. Second thing is you'll notice that we have an add cluster button here. Now in our particular case, we've grayed that out for this lab just because we don't want people adding clusters in this environment. But in a production environment, you would be able to add multiple clusters. When you add your cluster to the existing SDDC, you also have the opportunity to change your cluster type. So for instance, if you created your initial cluster as an i3, and maybe your second cluster needs to be an i3EN because you have some SQL servers or some other very RAM intensive or storage intensive workloads that you want on those i3EN clusters, you of course have that opportunity to change your host type for that second cluster. One thing that is not available through this wizard, however, is the ability to modify the CPU counts on the host, and that's something that needs to be done in VMC. Now, the other thing to note is that if you open VMC here and you create a cluster outside of the control shift wizard, you're not able to connect the uh, the Scale Out Cloud File System data store. The only way to do that connection is to have VCDR do that creation of the cluster. So that's again why we're not able to connect into an existing SDDC. You have to use our SDDC, and similarly, when you deploy those new hosts, those new clusters, they need to be created through VCDR. They can't be created directly through VMC. But if I do open in VMC, I will have the opportunity to do things like add and modify transit gateways, add and modify VPN configurations, configure HCX. So I still have all of my ability to manage like I would a traditional VMC cluster. So for instance, if I come into networking and security, and I decide to create or modify some VPN configurations, I can come in here and I can do that. Of course, if I want to build additional firewall rules that are a little bit more advanced, NAT rules that are a little bit more advanced, et cetera, I can do all that through here. So I still have all of my traditional VMC on AWS administrative control, but I am simplifying that a little bit through VCDR so that, again, if I'm maybe not familiar with VMC on AWS and I just need to really simply build some clusters, build some networks, build some NAT rules, etc., I can do that here. Now you'll notice that I personally already have my my network segment configured here, but if I needed to build that out, all I would need to do is give it a name, give it an IP gateway, and then give it a /24/16/8, whatever my my length is going to be. Um, I can reuse my on-prem environment's IP address ranges if I want to. And in my case, because I don't have a VPN back to my on-prem, because I'm not doing HCX back to my on-prem, all I'm doing is just using the replica appliance to get my data into the cloud. And when I fail over, the plan would be that this is going to be a standalone environment. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to reuse my IP space. Now, if this were going to be a Pilot Light installation where I was going to actually use Pilot Light as an extension of my on-prem data center, I would go ahead and I would probably instead I would create these segments, but then I would also use HCX to extend my on-premise data center. So that would be another thing that I'd want to do through here would be go ahead and add in HCX, which of course you can see is already active and deployed to a different data center. NAT rules, IP addresses, this is all pretty self-explanatory. Public IP addresses I can request run from Amazon. This is, again, another thing that we take into consideration versus a pilot light versus an on-demand. On-demand, whenever you spin down this cluster, you give your public IPs back to Amazon. You request new EIPs every time you you request new EIPs every time you spin up the cluster. And so again, if you need that more static configuration, that's again another place where we might recommend a pilot-like cluster versus an on-demand. And then of course, NAT and firewall rules, it's very simple. Now again, one of the things that I need to do from a firewall rule perspective is I do need to create a outbound any rule or an outbound any restrictive rule. For my network so that my VMs can talk to the internet. We don't by default create these rules for add-on networks. I can also create an inter-network rule to allow or deny traffic. And again, if I want to get fancy with it, I can come back over here into networking and security, and I can apply NSXT policies to these LANs. Again, we tried to keep it simple within VCDR, but still giving you that deep ability to modify things if you want to within the VMC control panel. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to take a quick pause. I'm going to wait for my replication to finish here. And once I have my snapshot replicated, we're going to go to DR plans and we're going to go ahead and create new plans and show you a test and a failover. There is one step that I forgot to mention as we were building out our SDDC, and it is folder creation within the software-defined data center itself. So much like on-premise, I have folders, and I need to go ahead and add those into the cloud so that I can have my folder mappings be a little more one-to-one. So I'm going to go to VMs and templates here. I'm going to add a folder structure. We're going to add a VMs and templates folder. We're going to call this CTJ Demo. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a subfolder. We're going to call it apps. And now I have a folder and a subfolder. So we can go to the DR plans. We can go ahead and we can create our first DR plan. We're going to call this CTJ Demo. We're going to call it Failover the Pi-hole server. And you'll notice that there are two options here for recovery. There's recover into an existing SDDC, and then there is recover into a SDDC that'll be deployed at a disaster or a test. The biggest difference that you see between these, existing SDDC is really built for customers who are doing pilot light, whereas recover into an SDDC that is deployed on failure is for on-demand customers. But if you look at the left-hand side here, all the pieces of orchestration that I can do with an existing SDDC versus if I change, I lose all of that. Basically, I have my steps in my orchestration, but I don't have my network mappings, my IP changes, all those things. So usually what I will recommend, even to customers who are doing on-demand, is that they build their initial SDDC. They build an existing SDDC plan, they fill out all the steps, they save the plan, they test the plan, and then once you're done, disable the plan, and then go ahead and the next time you need to spin up your SDDC, the only things that you need to change are the sites. Okay, so this allows you to have a lot more configuration pre-built into your plan, even if you're doing on demand. This one is really the only advantage is that you can create and modify these without an SDDC running. But in my opinion, it does not offer enough configuration, and so that's why I like existing SDDC. We're going to go ahead, we're going to take my protected site with my vCenter. I only have one SDDC, so no big deal there. We're going to grab CTJ Demo because, again, that's the only protection group at the site. Now, you will notice that if you have multiple sites, because we have single source site to single destination site, I can only see the groups that are at that site. So I will have to build additional plans for each additional site. course, I've got my data stored. There's only one mapping there, so we don't need to worry about it. vCenter, again, only one mapping there. Don't need to worry about it. Our folder mappings. So again, we'll notice, put it here, and then we'll put that into the apps folder. And okay. Now, to go back to that real quick, you will notice that I have a folder in blue here, which denotes that it is required in a failover step. So if I were to scroll through all my folders, anyone that shows up in blue needs a mapping in the recovery SDDC. We only have one, so we'll go ahead and move along. You've also noticed on the last couple tabs and on all the additional tabs that there is a failover and test mapping button. So if you leave it checked, it's the same for failover and test. If you uncheck it, you will get this tab. This is so that if you are running a pilot light, you are running production workloads in your pilot light. If I run a test, and we're going to talk about the difference between test and failover later, but if I run a test, I can specify for that to go into a sandbox rather than into the production environment so that I can have minimal disruption during my testing. Compute resources, again, we'll just map the prod cluster to the DR cluster. This is, again, super helpful if you have multiple clusters built out for things like Microsoft licensing or security. Maybe you run a multi-tenancy environment and you need to have certain resources mapped to certain hosts. This allows you to do those mappings, including in the failover. We'll go ahead and we're going to map our trusted LAN to our CTJ LAN. Once again, I can go ahead, create a second network mapping for test. So maybe I have built another LAN that has the same IP space, but it is maybe a host-only network, or maybe NSX is firewalling that off for us, so my test mapping is going to be different. Okay, now IP addresses. We can create rules for IP addresses to go ahead and take an octet. So if I want to do, say, 192.168.1 on premise and 10.1.2 in the cloud, or if I've got 10.10 in the on-prem and I want 10.11 in the cloud, I can make those pretty easy changes right here. I can also create an IP address where it is a one-off. So for instance, 10.1.2.4 becomes 10.1.2.10 in the cloud, right? So we can change either the first three or we can change all octets of the IPs. If I have no rule, which in this case I don't because I'm reusing my IP space from prem to cloud, which is our preferred way to do things, this is going to let me know, hey, I don't have any IP mappings, so either you need a DHCP scope in here or you need some other configuration. The reality is we actually don't need any of that because, again, all of our statics are just going to come over as we expect them to. Now, there are some limitations with our IP mappings, things like virtual network appliances that don't have traditional Linux or Windows positions for their IP address configuration utilities, right? So Windows, it's in the registry. Linux, it's usually in the etc interfaces. Or the DHCPD conf. If your virtual machine is not one of those flavors where we can easily find and change the IP address, it will fail. And you won't be able to change the IP. The only thing so far I've found that have been a problem are things like virtual firewalls, virtual load balancers, like F5 virtual load balancers or virtual NetScalers, virtual Palo Altos, pfSense boxes, things like that. For normal VMs, it works just fine. So, and in most cases, we're reusing our IP space anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now, the script VM, we're not going to use for this demonstration, but to walk through what it is, a script VM is where we run all of our scripts from. There was some internal discussion about should we include a scripting engine, should we be able to run things directly from Control Shift, and the answer ended up being no. The reason being is that, number one, when you write your own engine to do scripting, you end up taking on this huge product or this huge project of supporting, every common project in the world, right? Basically scrape GitHub and make sure that you're supporting all of it, because everybody's got their own flavor of things they want to use. The other problem that we find is that in a lot of cases, even if we do have support for everything, in a lot of times your scripts that you've written and customized to work for your on-prem environment don't always work when you port them into other tools, and it requires a rewrite. So what we decided is saying, okay, most customers have a utility server or some other type of server that allows for your scripts to run from anyway. And we'd rather just use that. And so we want to specify that VM and run all of our script steps and actions from there. In the case where you do not have a pilot light and you need to have your script VM fail over first, so if you get your on-prem VM and then your scripts VM, a lot of customers will create a standalone plan that usually has like Active Directory domain controller and then their script VM as the two VMs. There's no customization. They just bring them straight up, and then once those are up, then they bring up the rest of the environment. So we're going to click next, but in a later video, I am going to show some usage of the scripting VM. And then of course I have my recovery steps. And so in this particular case, it's just saying, hey, recover everything in one fell swoop, power it on if it was already power on and go. We don't want to do that. What we actually want to do is we want to start by recovering the group. So we want to recover the CTJ Demo group, and we don't want to power any VMs on. Basically what this will do is this will recover the group to a point in time, but it doesn't actually power on any VMs. So we put that in there. We're going to say recover group. Great. Whoops. Let me go back there real quick. I hit enter instead of OK, which doesn't always work. Okay. Let's modify that one more time. Okay, so CTJ Demo, there it is. The next thing I want to do is I want to recover the individual VM, and I'm going to select my VM from my group. And then I'm going to tell it after power on, I want to wait for the IP address. I'm going to wait 5 minutes for that IP address. Now you'll notice that I can wait for IP, I can wait for VMware tools, or I can run a script. Wait for IP, wait for VMware tools. I like these as recovery options. In fact, I like wait for IP a lot because it ensures that the network is up, that IP address changes have happened. But one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't take into account maybe if I don't have the right version of VMware tools installed, maybe I don't have VMware tools installed at all. This might not work. I could use a combination because, hey, in a Windows server, the IP comes up way before the VM does. So if I wait for the IP address and then I wait for VMware tools, now I know that I've got both. Running scripts, not something that I like to do as part of a recovery step. I like to do that as their own step. The reason being, if I recover a VM, everything goes well and my script fails, I want to be able to retry that step without having to do the full re-recovery and power on of the VM. I want that to be its own step, and we're going to call this recover DNS. Like I mentioned, if I wanted to do a script step, all I need to do is come to other actions, and I have a few things I can do. I can do wait for user input. This is really great for if maybe my VM doesn't have a service that I can script a check of. And so in this case, I could say log to admin. And in that particular case, again, maybe I don't have an API or something I can validate. You know, I want to validate beyond just, hey, is DNS mask running and is the HTTP port responding? I want to actually log in and see that everything's good. So I'm going to go ahead and call that check admin interface. Now I could also, if I wanted to, I could, under other actions, I could create a wait step. So I could just sleep for a fixed amount of time, right? This is super helpful for if I have maybe applications that I know, hey, they just take 5 minutes, right? So after we have the IP address come up, just sleep for 5 minutes, and then come back, because we know that's how long it takes for those services to run. And then of course we can also run a script, and this is where I was talking about you can run a script. It's its own step. You can have the individual script file. You can pass custom parameters. Now this is not interactive, so you do not have the opportunity to pass commands back and forth, get statuses, etc. So these scripts need to be able to run completely unattended. Now that our recovery steps are defined and customized, the last thing that we want to do is we want to define an alerts trigger for this particular plan. So you can set some global alerting in the configuration, but you can also set alerts for individual plans. So this is really important for things like if you're an organization that maybe has delegated access to individual app owners, and individual teams are going to be responsible for their recovery of their application set. You can customize the alerts so that that team will get only things that are pertaining to their failover plans, versus getting just a flood of emails about every plan in the environment and creating alarm fatigue. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select my email address here from my recipients tab. And then on the right hand side, I can see alert triggers. So I can get a alert every compliance check. This is not a super helpful alert for most people, but if you're creating like a ServiceNow action where every compliance check, whether it's red or green, it parses the email. That's a great alert for that. Compliance warning, compliance error, basically saying, hey, if something changes in the compliance reporting, I want to know about it. I can get a once a week summary of everything that's happened throughout the week. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check that one. I want a weekly summary. And then of course, when results have changed. So the nice thing about when results have changed, and why I prefer to use that one, is that it gives me an up-down status. So it's not just, hey, things have gone bad, but it's also, hey, things are good again. So I get both the failure as well as the remediation emails. And so for me, I like that as my alerting. And then of course, plan running, right? So failover status has changed. I want to know when someone's going to execute that. If it's waiting for user input, whether we have a user input step. So this is really nice in that, you could kick off a bunch of plans that have user input steps. You can step away to go work on other things, maybe work on your DNS or your CDN or your BGP failovers, and wait for the emails to come in that, hey, by the way, I need you to go check the SQL server. I need you to go check that web app. And so you're not getting sidetracked on something else while your plan just sits here and waits to execute. So you can get that nice email reminder. And then, of course, failover finished, waiting for user commit. So that's another thing, that when we do a failover, we don't commit the failover until you specify that, hey, yes, this is actually, this is correct, this is what I want, and go ahead and start the reprotect step, which is, of course, getting ready for the failback in the future. And so once again, this is just another way that we can kind of poke you if you're doing something else, to say, hey, I want to make sure that we finish these plans out. Okay, so plan is all set. Before we start talking about tests and failovers, I want to talk about the continuous compliance checking. So again, we are checking 18 different things here. We have our protected site that we're validating. So we're validating that the snapshots are happening, that the VMs are good to go. Our recovery site, we're doing health checks into the recovery site. Is everything available? On the orchestration pieces, are the networks and folders matching up? Is all that good? And then of course we do VMC health checks, because we want to make sure that your target environment that you're failing over into is going to be healthy. And if you ever need to generate a report, whether your boss asks, or whether a compliance person asks, or an auditor, whatever it is, I can click create PDF report there, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to generate a report of this particular compliance check. So this one happened 22 minutes ago. if I want, I can either wait for another 8 minutes and it will run itself automatically. These run every 30 minutes. Or I can hit the button here and I can have it kick off a check right now. And if I bring this report up, we can see what it actually looks like from a compliance check summary. So we can see the compliance checks, when they happened, and what their results were. So if you need this again for supporting documentation for compliance, it's a very easy to generate report. So we've got green check marks, and it's now the time of the week or the month or the quarter where I need to test my plan. The plan is in ready status. I know that I have good snapshots. In fact, actually, you can see right here on the right-hand side that I recently took a snapshot. So I know that I've got good protection. I know that everything's in compliance. So let's go ahead and let's test this plan. So the first thing that we notice here is it gives me the ability to use a different snapshot. So you can see here, I've got my initial snapshot, and then I've got snapshots going back, every 4 hours rolling to dailies. I could use the most recent snapshot, but if I wanted to, I could also go back a couple hours. And that's what we're going to do here, is to show you what would it be like if I didn't want to recover my most recent snapshot. And this is something that I've run into in the past doing compliance, where, when you're doing vendor compliance for peer businesses, they'll say things like, hey, I don't care about your most recent snapshot. Everybody can bring up their most recent backup. But I want you to go back a couple hours or a couple days and pull that back up, because that'll show me that, if your most recent was corrupted for whatever reason, again, ransomware, bad patch, configuration change that took down the environment, you're going to need to fail over to an older copy. And I want you to prove that that older copy works. So in my case, I'm going to go back to a 4 a.m. snapshot. It's going to let me know it's not the most recent. We know that. We selected it. And then this snapshot is good to go. So it's telling me, hey, it's not the most recent, but I've validated it. It's ready to go. Then we can talk about error handling. Do we want to ignore the errors, or do we want to stop on the errors? In this case, it's a test. I want to fix things, so I want to stop on errors. If this was a failover, I might say ignore errors, and I might just force it through. Now, you do have the ability on errors, you can force completion, but ignore all errors is kind of that sledgehammer. Hey, everything's down. I just need you to fail it over, and we'll fix the problems once we're failed over. And then, of course, test storage migration. So I have two options. One is I can do a storage vMotion into the SDDC, or I can leave the VMs and files in the cloud backup, and I want to leave them in the cloud backup. The difference is obviously the SDDC storage is NVMe backed vSAN. It's very, very high performant, low latency storage. This is super great for things like databases or heavy I/O applications where they need that ultra low latency, they need that high performance. The reality is, though, most workloads can run just fine from the cloud backup, and we actually recommend that you just run them from the cloud backup storage full time rather than doing that storage vMotion. But you have that option here that you can do one or the other. We also recommend in testing that you leave this on the cloud backup. And the reason being is that storage vMotion, depending on how big your VMs are, it could take a few minutes, it could take a few hours, right? The nice piece is that the VMs are running during that storage vMotion. So just like in your on-premise vCenter, where when you kick off a storage vMotion, it doesn't shut down the virtual machine. It keeps the virtual machine running. There's a little bit of a performance hit, and then it does its move. So that's the upside, is that you get to use those VMs while they're doing their storage vMotion. But in the case of a test, again, we don't need to spend that time proving that out. We can just run them from the backup storage, and it will be able to do everything that we want it to do for test. Next thing is, of course, it's going to show me my recovery steps. In this case, it's just a very simple step. It's going to power this guy on, and it's going to verify that it comes online. And then we're going to do test plan. And again, there's a lot of places here where you're going to write out what you're doing as kind of that double confirmation. So when we do failover VMs, when we do test plan, when we do commit failover, commit failback, delete a protection group, delete a snapshot, we have you do this double verification and type out what you're doing so that you're 100% sure this is what I want to be doing. Again, as someone who's failed over data centers at 4 o'clock in the morning after 36 hours of no sleep trying to fix problems, it's always good to have that one extra step to validate, yes, I know what I'm doing. I'm committing to what I'm doing. This is what I want to do. And we're going to go ahead, we're going to run this test. So we can see the steps here, but the other thing that I want to show you is if I click over into my Cloud vCenter, right? So if I look at my VMC cluster, we're going to be able to see that we have VMs that are recovering. We have the AS Pi-hole server. It's right here. And if I come back here, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to wait for these steps to finish. We're reconfiguring. We're doing all of our steps. And now we've got a VM powered on, and we can come over here and we can validate that my Pi-hole server is powered on. And we'll launch the web console. And we can see that it's up. And then if I log in here, oops, helps if you remember your own password. Nope. As I say, there we go. Helps if you can also type. So there we go. So I can see my VM's good. I can see it's up and it's online. And then if I really wanted to, I could come in here and I could do oops. Oops. And it's Pi-hole. Yeah, that's just Pi-hole dash dash. The dash? No, it's no dashes. There we go. Okay, so I can see that my Pi-hole service is listening. I've got things responding. It's all good. And if I were to log in, I could see the web interface as well. So there we have it. My server is up. It's running. And I'm going to come back here. I've validated that everything's good. I've created my, I've done whatever I need to do on my end to validate that my test works. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell it clean up test. And when we clean up the test, what we're going to see on this side is that we're just going to hard shut down the server. We're going to delete the server from inventory. And then we're going to go ahead and clean up the rest of this piece. Test finished with no errors. So again, if I refresh this, it'll come back and tell me that, yep, everything's good. So with a test, we don't capture any data. We don't replicate it back. We don't take a backup, anything like that. Test is just that. It's test. You bring it up, you validate it, you throw it away. It's disposable. And again, the idea being that I could come back in here multiple times and I could retest from different points if I wanted to. So you saw how quickly that was to bring up that VM. I could bring that VM up from multiple points in time and do multiple different tests to multiple different points in time if I needed to. And again, it doesn't matter if it's 1 VM, 25 VMs, 100 VMs, they all come up that quickly. If I come back here now, the test has cleaned itself up and I can click acknowledge. I could create any additional comments. So we could write remember your password next time to remind ourselves that we should probably remember the passwords we use for things or use password manager. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click acknowledge. And when I acknowledge this, the last thing that it's doing is it's generating the report of all the actions that we did in this test. So you'll notice, okay, the test is cleaned up, it's acknowledged, everything's good, and I'm back to ready. So I could launch another test to another point in time. So I could go back to here and we could do this all over again. I could kick a failover if I needed it to. But in my case, I've tested everything successfully, and I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to select my test plan, and I'm going to go ahead and create the PDF to show that this tested successfully. So I have an email that this test completed successfully, but now I want the actual PDF report. So I'm going to click create PDF. And again, this is going to be the report that I'm either going to put in my change control, I'm going to put in my monthly maintenance statement, I'm going to send to my compliance officer, my boss, my CTO, whoever it is that needs to see that, yes, we tested it and yes, it worked. And if I bring this up, it's actually really nice because this single report kind of takes care of all the reports that we would usually need to generate, and it just makes it into one big PDF. So I have my plan summary. I can see that my RTO here was 36 seconds. So again, if you look at a lot of VMware's marketing around this, we say near zero RTO. We don't say instantaneous RTO, we say near zero RTO because in this case, it took 36 seconds to recover and power on those VMs. That's not zero, that's 36 seconds. Obviously, the more customization, the more you throw in here, but these plans are very, very rapid to recover. But still, 36 seconds from initial click to powered on VM, us logging in. So that's pretty awesome. Then my cleanup started at 1941. It finished at 1941. So again, the cleanup was very, very rapid as well. It didn't hang on anything. It was nice and easy. And then I can come down into plan configuration mappings, and I can see all the things about the application mapping, the network mappings, IP addresses, script VMs, the alerts. It basically is giving me a full overview of everything in the runbook. And again, it's giving me everything in the runbook so that these reports, if they're handed to someone who doesn't have access to the VMC control panel, they can see what's in the runbooks as well, so that they can compare when we get down into the actual failover steps and then the failover actions. They can validate that the runbook matched what we actually did. Notice failover log, and then of course the cleanup log, and then there's an error log for both the failover and the cleanup. And this is true as well for the failover VMs. The nice thing about this is that it does capture retries, force throughs, things like that. So you can have a good log of, hey, we ran into this problem, we took this remediation step, it worked, we moved on. Or we tried these remediation steps, none of them worked, we forced it complete, and we'll worry about it later. So you have a very, very good log. And then of course, last page is blank. The other thing that's really cool about the reports page, you'll notice that again, I have my test and my failover, and I can split these out. I can look for just failovers, I can look for just tests, but I also have a configuration change log. And so if you are an organization that needs to show pre and post configuration changes, that's what we can do here. We show the individual changes. So this will be the creation of the plan, and then of course my one change to the plan, and I can create those pre and post state PDFs from here. So again, if you need that level of documentation, we do include that in here, which is again really, really nice. With that, this is kind of everything we wanted to show you in this demo. We looked at creating an initial VCDR Infrastructure, we hooked up our site, we created a protection group and replicated some snapshots. And then of course, we tested our DR plan to validate that everything will fail over successfully. I want to thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at joyceca@vmware.com. Thanks.